So maybe young people that are kind of my audience will end up watching it even if they're not on Today Live. So yeah, I was talking to Justin, and I think I talked to John a little bit about this too, that when I went to the homeless meeting that we were invited to attend, I saw that homeless or foster kids end up being homeless like 20% of the time, way higher than the general population. And I thought, well, maybe I could be sort of a dad, coach, mentor, friend, whatever, to somebody when they age out, because it's one thing to have a roof over your head and be taken care of in a foster family, but when you age out, how are you going to cope with life out there in the world? And my dad was great for giving me a lot of advice. Most of it I have tried to follow, and so probably a lot of this sort of thing comes from him. And then I had read various books and so on. So my audience is really high school and college kids age, not most of us that are on this meeting. And I don't pretend to be an expert on investing, on how to invest best. And so if any of you were looking for that advice, I don't know any more than anybody else, less than most maybe. But I mostly wanted to be a cheerleader about how important compound interest is and how important it is to start in high school or college to save money for retirement. Because if you do that, you'll be a lot better off than if you wait till you're 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 to start saving for retirement. And that's not the only subject I have, but that's sort of the main thing. And, you know, my title about things I didn't learn in school, it's not really, there are certain things that aren't part of a school topic, call it math, English, Spanish, whatever, that are still good things to learn. I know my father used to say, I think everybody should take a class in personal finance. He ended up being an accountant. So they had such a class in college when he was in school. And then also public speaking. And I've never led a Zoom meeting. I'm not a public speaker, never have been. But I was in sales, so I'm comfortable talking. But I think there's something to that advice he had, personal finance and public speaking. Public speaking, people are more afraid of that than going to the dentist. So if you can learn to handle that, you know, that's helpful. And so a number of you have been pastors, so you're used to public speaking, but I'll bet initially it was probably kind of tough. So anyway, that's sort of how I got into, decided to do this meeting, and Justin say, hey, Jeff, you know, coronavirus, why don't we do a Zoom meeting? And then maybe people could log on. And if anybody thinks, yeah, Jeff, that was kind of helpful, I think, for a young child, or not child, a young person, maybe you ought to go to the high schools and talk to a class of 20, 30 kids or something like that, or over to the boys club or something. So that was kind of my idea. But anybody can ask questions whenever they like. And you might know somebody who's 18 or 25 or 20 or something that you could, you know, pass along anything if you find anything useful. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about my educational experience, especially high school, because it's a little bit unique. Doesn't mean now I figured out everything, but and maybe some of you have had a similar situation. But I went to a high school, junior high and high school, in what was a fairly rough neighborhood. So I'll start out talking a little bit about, well, I'm going to give you a little bit about my background. Some of you know it anyway, that I'm Norwegian. My family came from the Midwest, kind of Midwestern values. I grew up in the church, Lutheran church. And, but financially, we had no money. I shouldn't say that. We made it month to month, but we were month to month like most people. My dad would borrow money from me at the end of the month so we could eat. I was like his bank. And it was usually $5, $10, you know, just to make it till payday for the last 3 or 4 days sometimes. And I won $100 when I was about 8 years old at the grand opening of a bank, and I never spent a dime. I put it in the bank, and, you know, I was always the saver. My brother was Candy Randy. He'd go Little League Diamond at the snack shack and buy penny candies and spend all of his allowance all the time. And I was known as the one that didn't. So that's sort of been my personality. But anyway, back to my educational experience, I grew up in a neighborhood where you got the most credibility from your peers. Number one, if you could fight. Number two, if you were a good athlete. Three would be if you did drugs, stole things, or had sex in junior high, you know, things that aren't really considered good social behavior by the establishment, I guess you'd say. And it was a pretty rough neighborhood. We had some racial tensions from time to time. My best friend was a black guy, Keith. He basically, when we went from elementary school to junior high, he had to disassociate himself with me because he was threatened and called an Uncle Tom and all that kind of stuff. But most of the time, well, maybe that's not right. We shouldn't say most of the time. One-on-one, a lot of people got along well, but there were big gang fights, or not gang fights, what do you call them, riots? There were big fights of like 100 people on each side at the schools. They shut down the schools, not only for that day, but for the next few days to calm things down. Walking home from school, I saw guns pulled, all kinds of stuff. There were fights typically the way it would work. Well, when I was living in Los Altos, I played in a tennis ladder for a little while, and you would challenge a guy above you, and they put out a letter once a week or once a month or whatever, and see what the rankings were, and you would challenge a guy. If you beat him, you moved up. If you lost, he would move up. Well, we had an unwritten ranking. So if someone said they could whoop you, then you had to defend that and fight after school. So we had fights probably 3 to 5 a week. And when I went to Beverly in almost 3 years, there was one I knew of that I heard of. So going from Sacramento, Luther Burbank High School, you can look it up. It got a college readiness score of 2, which surprised me, didn't get a 1. Well, that's recently. It's probably better now than it was. But Beverly was a 10. So night and day difference. And when I went to Beverly, I met with my counselor who gave me my classes. I went into the hallway and a guy said to another guy, "What'd you get on that test?" And I started to, I thought for sure someone was going to get punched, because at my old school, you could not talk in the hallways about school. If you did, you were likely going to be slammed up against the locker or punched. Might be real hard in the arm. They hit you as hard as they could in the arm or something, maybe not in the face, but you literally could not talk about school. If you carried books home from school, you should be prepared to defend yourself, because it was not cool to take books home to do homework. So anyway, at Beverly, they openly talked about doing well in school, and they openly talked about where they were going to go to college. And whereas like 5% of people tried hard in school at my old neighborhood, was more than 95% of Beverly. It was so different. So what I would like to tell people is, it's not where you go to school that counts, it's who your peers are. Even if you go to Burbank, if you hang out with that 5% that care about school, and you work together on homework, and you think it's good to be a good student, that will serve you well. If you learn to work hard and manage time and all those kind of things a person learns in school. Whereas, my dad was an accountant. He was a budget analyst for the Cal State University system. So he looked up dollars spent per student. And that's why we had a little 2-bedroom apartment. My brother and I shared a room, a block and a half inside of the city limits of Beverly Hills, so we could go there. But, and they had nice facilities and stuff, but it was really the students. And so, I don't know, I just think that if somebody knows that people in my older neighborhood became doctors, and high-ranking Keith, my good friend, high-ranking military rank, I forgot, he was at the Air Force Academy, and did really well there. You can, in any neighborhood, you can end up doing well, and any place, but you have to believe that there's a result for working hard. If you don't believe there's a result for working hard because people from our neighborhood never get out, then you're doomed and dooming yourself. And I just think that's such a shame. So if I'm talking to anybody that is not from a Beverly Hills type high school, you'll still do fine. In other words, I got to see what was on the other side of the curtain. I got to see what it was like at the Beverly, and it wasn't just a bunch of privileged kids because their parents were wealthy. They got these good jobs. They were really serious about school. So I suppose that's those are my main comments about that, but I don't want it to be around just talking the entire time. Do any of you have questions about my experience at either school, or do you think my conclusions from living in those two environments are inaccurate, or maybe I haven't explained some things well about the differences? Just curious.
Hey, Jeff,
Yeah.
this is Jean, and I have a comment. I remember many years after you left Sacramento,
Yeah.
we went back and went to Keith Woodfork's house.
Yeah.
And visited his dad,
right,
and his mom. And I was very surprised walking in. I was nervous walking in from the street. I had our two young daughters and knocked on the door and went inside the house. And Keith's mom and dad, I felt, had a huge impact on their children, because their daughter, one of Keith's sisters, became a news commentator, at the news station in Sacramento. And did he have a brother who became?
And a brother, and I'm trying to remember what he was, either a physician. He had a really good job. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he
medical
was,
doctor.
Yeah, very accomplished.
What I was hit by was what a huge impact his parents had on him and his siblings, because they did have high expectations of their kids. And, just were so supportive of them throughout their lives.
Yeah.
Everywhere I looked, I could see photos, family photos, and that really, really struck me.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, Mr. Woodfork was a wonderful man. We visited him a couple times, years like when I was in my 40s or 50s, and I always liked him. My dad was a really good friend of his. He was a military Air Force guy, Mr. Woodfork. So Keith got some of the upbringing that I did about discipline. My dad was drafted and he hated being in the Marines, to tell you the truth. But he said they teach discipline, and that's one thing that's lacking, is people don't have enough discipline. And so he really liked Mr. Woodfork, that he was a career person in the Air Force, and that he was just such a good, solid guy. And so anyway, yeah, the Woodforks were wonderful.
Yeah, so it's not just your peers, who
right.
have
parents do. And studies will show there's a father in the home versus not a father in the home makes a huge difference. And I'm not criticizing single parents. It's really hard to be a single parent. Jean didn't travel much when our kids were growing up until they were in high school or college. She did more, but whenever she was out of town and it was all on me, wow, it's so much harder than when it was both of us. So anyway, so if there are no other comments about that, I'll move on to financial planning. And I'll tell a quick story about my dad. We never knew anybody who had any money when I was growing up. My grandparents didn't, nobody did. But my dad, after my parents got divorced when I was between 6th and 7th grade, and my dad dated a woman a number of years later, and her friend or relative apparently was a wealthy man, and he said, "Well, do you mind sharing with me how you became wealthy?" And he said, "It doesn't matter if they're turning the lights off because you can't pay the electricity bill and you're living in the gutter. Pay yourself first 15%. So anyway, that's how he accumulated money. So, but I thought, well, I'm kind of wanting to plan for retirement, because I'd heard that a lot of companies now don't provide the pension plans they used to provide. So I started reading some books, and none of them are really high level investing. They were just motivating to me to kind of learn about what does it take so that when I'm done working, I can retire. And so I'll go over 3 or 4 of those books and just a few highlights from each book. But we're going to talk about planning for retirement, taxes, but then putting money into perspective, especially if you're a Christian, but what's your purpose for being here on this planet? And then a little bit too about where you get news from. And I think the educational system has a little bit of bias politically as well. And so I'll talk just super briefly about that. So, another person a person that's been really inspirational to me, I was old enough that I don't know that that's what made me do better than I would have if I never heard about this guy. But Ben Carson, some of you might only know him from a political point of view because he ran for president. But other than his politics, he grew up in a real rough neighborhood in, I think, Detroit. And he thought that he wasn't very bright. He thought, oh man, I'm dumb. And he was in like second grade. And he was getting F's on all of his work and so on. And then the schools tested him, and it turned out he couldn't see very well. And he was always sitting at the back of the class. He's a little shy. So they moved him up towards the front of the class. And there's a book called Gifted Hands about him, and then a movie too. Cuba Gooding Jr. plays Ben Carson. And it turns out after he could see better and they moved him up to the front, he started getting D's right away, and then C's, and then B's. And then he thought he was smart, and he got straight A's like forever, and became the first neurosurgeon to separate Siamese twins. He had a whole team of 25, 30 other doctors. He was head of, I don't know if it's a specific department, but he was the chief neurosurgeon at Mount Sinai, or one of those. I can't remember for sure where the hospital was. I think it was John Hopkins. But anyway, a very famous surgeon. And he started out with very humble beginnings. And the only reason why I bring that up is if you don't believe in yourself, you don't have confidence, you're not going to do much. I learned a lot about that playing football. If you hold back because you think, I'm going to lose going one-on-one with this guy in a tackling drill, you're going to lose. But, mass times acceleration squared is equal to velocity. And if you have a certain amount of mass, and I wasn't as heavy in the stomach as I am now, so at 165 pounds in high school, if I was going up against some guy 230 or 220 or something, I had to move quickly. So you better have the confidence to go as hard and fast as you can, or you're going to end up on your back. And I found you could put the other guy on his back if you had more confidence than he did. So you've got to just go for it sometimes. So anyway, as far as retiring financially independent, and that's sort of the thing, you want to hit a critical mass of money so you can live off the interest someday. We'll talk about compound interest and how that might work. But I also want to say that money's just a game, and you don't want to have money define you. You're no better a person if you end up accumulating money, or if you made a lot of money while you were working. It's not a measure of self-worth. It's not a measure of how much God loves you. It's not a measure of how good a person you are. It's just one aspect of your life that I would encourage you to try to do well and start early, but don't make it that big a deal. It's just, my dad used to always say, it's just your money, it's not your life. If something, something broke and it was worth a lot of money or something, I don't want to overplay the importance of it, because I just think it's the smart thing to do. And I think that I was actually listening to Dave Ramsey today driving around, and he said, my view, he's saying now, his view is he doesn't own anything. God owns it all. And so, but he's a steward of all the things that are under his control. And so if he's the steward of these blessings, then he should treat them well, and he should grow them, and then share them with other people. And so you can do a lot of good if you accumulate money. You can also not be a burden to other people. So there are some positive things about saving money, and not just fritter it away. But understanding compound interest is what I'll start off with now. So I heard a story once when I was about 25, 3 times in 6 months. And I thought, wow, that's almost like a sign. Is God trying to tell me something, or somebody's trying to tell me something? This is kind of weird. And the story, and I heard it once on PBS, once in a book I read, and then once HP had a financial planning seminar that I went to with Gene, where spouses were invited. And the story goes like this. I think 11% was the assumed interest because that's what the average was at that time. They used $2,000 because that was the maximum of an IRA. Like I say, this quite a few years ago. And these two really good friends get together at 63 years old and have dinner. And one of them started saving $2,000 a year at 22 and did it for 7 years. The other one waited till he's 29. So he didn't save any of those 7 years, and then he started saving $2,000 a year. They sat down together, talked about, are you getting close to being able to afford to retire? And it turns out they each had $1.3 million. So one guy saved $14,000, the other one saved $68,000, and they have the same amount of money. And you might wonder, well, how is that possible? Well, the first guy who started out with $2,000 at a 10% return, not 11, he's going to have $2,200 after the first year. And if you run that out to 7 years, he has $2,087 by the time the 7 years are up. So if you earn 10% again, his contribution was $2,087, whereas the other guy now contributed $2,000. So the other guy never catches him. They're pretty much even the rest of the way. And the other thing is, the better way to go is to just save that $2,000 the entire time. And then you'd have 2.6 million instead of 1.3. So that was a story I thought was interesting. Albert Einstein is quoted as saying, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it. So when I get to some biblical quotes, there's a line that's, or a verse that's kind of similar to that, but he who understands it earns it. In other words, you want to be on the lending side, and then he who doesn't pays it. And Albert Einstein was a pretty sharp guy. I know you guys all know who he is. I don't know if young kids do, but I explained that to him, I guess. You know, theory of relativity equals MC squared, all that stuff. And then also when you're thinking about this, there's a rule of 72 that is more complicated than my way of explaining it, but it basically says money doubles in 10 years at 7% return, and it doubles in 10 years. It doubles every 10 years at a 7% return, but it doubles in 7 years with a 10% return. And those are just kind of good numbers to have in your head if you're kind of wondering, if I save this amount of money and it keeps doubling once every 10 years, how will that turn out? So, but to someone who's young, let's say you're 18, 22, and you work enough that maybe you could save $2,000 in a year, it might seem boring that it takes either 7 or 10 years to double your money. Wow, I made $2,000, but that took me like 10 years. Well, if you average a 10% return, which is what the stock market quite often does, so it took you 7 years to double your money. And it's kind of boring when it goes from 2,000 to 4,000, but when you go from 67 to 73, it goes from 512,000 to 1,024,000. And if you can live till you're 120, then you're really good. But that's it, assuming you never spend money. But anyway, this compound interest can really make a huge difference, whether you start saving at 18, 22, 29, whatever. It makes a big difference. And there's that other old saying, I wish I planted a tree 20 years ago if it's an avocado tree and takes a long time or whatever, because the best time to plant that tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. So if someone hasn't started early, that doesn't mean the game's over, quit. That means just start now. So now I'll tell you about some of the books I read. I thought they were interesting. We'll see what you guys think. One was The Millionaire Next Door. It was written in 1996. I didn't read it that long ago, but so when he talks about millionaires, a millionaire in 96 that bought more than it does now, but it's still a strong sum of money either way. And these guys, Stanley and Danko, that wrote the book, they were marketing guys, or they worked with marketing people. There were more statisticians and economists that studied things, and a marketing company wanted to sell to wealthy people. So they were going to sell Rolex watches and fancy cars and, advertise in magazines, just approach companies that sold things where their market was wealthy people. So they had a meeting at a hotel. They got a list of some people at a high net worth, They invited these people. They had a spread of food for them, and they were going to ask them like 200-300 questions. So these people started showing up, and one of them in charge of the thing sends one of the other employees down to the hotel lobby to say, double check whether or not they got the wrong room. They must have the signs switched because we're not getting these millionaires we're looking for. And then as these people started coming in, they were checking the names, and sure enough, they were on the list. They ignored the caviar. They didn't know one bottle of wine from another. And they were dressed very casually, no fancy Rolex watch or expensive clothes. So what they learned when they studied these guys was 80% of them were first generation millionaires. 80% were college graduates. Less than 20% of them earned even 10% of their wealth from their parents, or inherited 10% of their wealth. Less than 20% inherited, less than 10%. The main characteristic is they were frugal, their parents were frugal, their spouse was frugal, they spent less than they made. They didn't buy expensive watches, cars, homes, clothes, none of that. So then one of those same two guys, Stanley, wrote another book in 2009 called Stop Acting Rich. And he said there's a fraction of 1% of people that make a ridiculous amount of money that can both act rich and be rich. But for the other 99.9% of us, you can either act rich or be rich, but you can't be both. So some people in this Millionaire Next Door, they studied two surgeons. Each had incomes of like $700,000. They were very accomplished surgeons. One had a net worth that was very high, and the other guy had a net worth of zero. And when he studied the families, they spent what they made in this one family. So other things about what they found studying people was 2/3 of country club members were not millionaires. The millionaires bought cheap cars, the same kind of thing in the earlier book. He quoted Henry David Thoreau, "The man is richest whose pleasures are cheapest." And when Gene and I met with the people at Integris, which is who we work with, they asked us, what's most important to you? And we went through everything that was important to us, our faith, our family, vacations, but also, how about, does it need to be fancy vacation? No, not really. And just time with the kids and grandkids and so on. And then, they pointed out, well, if all this goes down the tubes, you're still in good shape then, right? And yeah, that's right. But, we were in agreement on that. Another interesting book I read was called The Automatic Millionaire by David Bach. And he basically said the way to accumulate money is to do it automatically. Have it taken out of your check, just like taxes are. And because if you don't see it, you can't spend it. And that's about the only way to do it. If you try to save what's left over at the end of the month, you'll never, well, most people, 95% of us, won't end up saving as much as if it's automatic. And then he's known as for something called the latte factor, which I thought was kind of interesting. He was giving a lecture and he said, start out in a smaller amount. If you can't save much, $10 a day will actually accomplish quite a bit. And there was a couple sitting there, and one of the guys says, yeah, but we just can't save any money. We can't save $10 a day. And he says, well, I see you and your wife have a Starbucks coffee. Yeah, that's true. Well, did you buy anything to eat when you were there? I said, yeah. We each got a muffin, and well, how much was that? Well, that was $12. I said, well, if you brewed your coffee at home and got the muffins at the grocery store, it probably cost you about $2. So there's your $10 a day. So that's where he came up with that latte factor. And it turns out if you save $10 a day in 40 years at a conservative 7% return, that would be $58,400 you'd have at the end of 40 years. So, and that's if you do it only one year, I mean. But if you did it every year, it wouldn't have to be, you could never go to Starbucks, I don't mean that. But if you could save $10 a day, you would have $58,400 to spend 40 years later. And if you did it every year, well, okay, then next year I got another $58,400. So interest really does compound a lot, because that's only $3,600 a year ends up giving you $58,000, almost $59,000 40 years later. Dave Ramsey wrote another book I read in 2003, and all these guys have probably written multiple books. I'm just picking on the ones I read. Some interesting things I think I got out of them. His was one of his quotes is, "We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like." And I really like him. We went to, at one of my daughter's churches, they had a Dave Ramsey program where, Gene, was it every week or every other week?
It was every Friday.
Every Friday for 2 months or so, something like that. And some of the people there had become Dave Ramsey coaches or something. But anyway, we broke out into tables and we had workbooks and read his book and so on. It was really good. But he said, another quote of his is, "Live like no one else now so you can live like no one else later." And so he's saying, be really frugal now so later, so you're not living like your cohorts that have a higher lifestyle financially, but then later you'll have more money than they will. Maybe that was obvious, but anyway, the other things he's big on are eliminating debt. He's like a broken record on that. And he's on the radio every day. And when people get out of debt, that had debt, they call in and they cheer and everybody, kind of like throw a party on the radio, so to speak. And he's big on emergency funds. And in the coronavirus that we're going through now, if someone lost their job and his emergency fund is usually 6 months, or he recommends 6 months of your salary. So if you had 6 months of salary, you could handle being unemployed for 6 months. And even if we don't have a coronavirus, you can be the greatest employee in the world and still lose your job. It's just a fact. So emergency fund is really important. And he says, then you start investing after you get your emergency fund and you get out of debt. But so that's kind of what I got from that. Some other ideas to mention might be that for a younger person, Social Security may not even be around when you retire. So don't plan on that, but that would be extra icing on the cake when you retire. Pension plans are not really around anymore unless you work for the government. But the government has some pretty good pension plans, but they are having to downgrade them from what they used to be. So in many cases, because they've had such good pension plans that they can't afford to pay for them, a lot of the government. My dad, back when my dad worked for the state as a budget analyst, he could have made more money in private industry back then. Now I think government pays as well as private industry. Back then they were known for not doing that. But when someone asked him, "How do you like working for the state, Don?" he'd say, "Oh, it's cradle to grave," because once you retire, they were known for having such a good retirement. And he made more money in retirement than he did when he worked. And part of the reason was he started there late. And just to give you an idea of how work ethic and all of this is something that's part of the formula, is that my dad played college basketball. So he played it in Minnesota for a year at Gustavus Adolphus, which Paul might have heard of, I don't know. But anyway, it's a small Lutheran school. And then he went to University of Minnesota to play in the Big Ten, and they found out he had a heart murmur, so he couldn't play basketball. And he was so disappointed he quit college. But then when he had 3 kids, he worked nights at the newspaper, and as a linotype operator, that job doesn't exist anymore, but you were typing a set with these aluminum molten lead that would create the letters. Anyway, and then he would go to school during the day. And so, he worked hard to get that degree and then did better. And later in his life, he did accumulate some money, even though all through high school, by the time I got out of high school, his net worth was 0. So you can still plant the tree later and do all right. So that's, now I'm ready for my biblical quotes. So I'll just read some I found it's not an all-inclusive one, but different things the Bible has to say about money. Proverbs 21:17, wine and luxury are not the way to riches. So clear back in the days of the Old Testament, there's some really good, solid advice. Proverbs 21:20, the wise have wealth and luxury, but fools spend whatever they have. Then some New Testament ones here. Luke 12:15, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. So I don't want to give the wrong impression just because you're saving money. Now we're going to worship money, right? Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So I'm not saying to serve money, but you know, be a good steward of your blessings, and don't just throw it all away and not pay attention to it. And then 1 Timothy 6:10 and 11, for the love of money is the root of all evil. And that's misquoted sometimes. A lot of people you might hear say, money is the root of all evil, but it doesn't say that. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. Proverbs 10:4, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Proverbs 3:9, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops. So don't forget the church and charity. Proverbs 22:7, just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender. And that's kind of like that Einstein quote that I had mentioned. Any questions on any of that? Any biblical quotes I missed? A lot of you know those kind of things well. Before I move on to my next topic, I know I'm doing all the talking, so any ideas from you guys? No?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That's
all right.
Good.
So now I'm going to talk about taxes, because taxes are a big part of retirement planning. I've used 401ks a lot, so has Gene, for us in savings, and it's great. It's like that David Bach said in the Automatic Millionaire, make it automatic. If you try to have the discipline to save, it just doesn't work. And later, my company offered a Roth 401k, but I had basically all my money in a traditional 401k. When I looked at how much money we had, I thought, oh, that's pretty good. I think we'll be all right. Not that we're not going to be all right, but it was kind of misleading because you're taxed at ordinary income. So if you have $1 million in a traditional 401k, unless you can take out just a little bit every year and live off of that, when you take it out as taxed ordinary income, you might have only $600,000 to spend or $700,000 to spend, not the million, because the government will get the other 300 or 400,000. So just be aware of that. So Roths, whether it's a Roth 401k or a Roth IRA, might be a better way to go. It turns out if your tax bracket's the same when you start to save this money as when you get it later, mathematically it works out the same. But you're just a little misled when you think you have more money than you really do, spendable money. The other thing is, though, if you're at a lower tax bracket when you're saving the money, the fact that you don't get to make a deduction is not as painful from a tax point of view as if when you retire, you're in a higher tax bracket. So that's where the Roth would be better. And to some of the younger people, you might not know what I even mean about traditional IRA or Roth IRA, so I'll explain that. Traditional IRA, the money you put in is tax deductible, it grows tax-free, but then it's taxed when you take it. With the Roth, the money you put in is not deductible, but it grows tax-free, and when you take it out, it's tax-free. So if you're in a higher tax bracket when you're taking it out, you'd be better off having done the Roth. If you're at a higher tax bracket when you put it in, you'd be better off doing the traditional. And my guess is, it doesn't matter who's in the White House or who's in the legislature, we always seem to spend more than we make, so taxes may have to go up in the future. So I think Roths are a really good idea. An example of that is, let's say you're making $35,000 a year, state and federal income tax, at that level of 35,000, you pay 12%. But if, let's say, later in your career, you're making 85,000, it's 24%. And if you're making 161,000, which would be a real strong income, then it's 32%. So it kind of depends on what tax bracket you're in when you're saving the money. You might switch where in your younger years, earlier in your career, you're doing Roths, but then later you might decide to switch to the other. But also just kind of be aware if it's going to get taxed later, you really don't have as much spendable money as you think you do. And then other kind of taxes to just sort of be aware of are Social Security tax is 6.2%. If you start a business of your own, I used to always sell to dentists, so they were, sole proprietor, entrepreneur types that were the employer, they owned the company. So they had to pay 12.4% because normally you pay the employee and the employer portion of Social Security tax. So that's 12.4% to add on to the state and federal taxes I mentioned. Then Medicare tax is another 1.5%. And sales tax, when you go to buy something, is 9%. Property taxes are 1% of what you owe. So taxes are a huge amount. And I'll tell you something that happened to Gene and I that someone should be aware of too, because laws can change with taxes. So just because you think you got it down, what the tax laws are, you got to keep checking in. I tried to check in with my accountant, but he misunderstood me. He thought I knew more than I did. So he said, oh yeah, Jeff, you get that exclusion when you sell your house. That hasn't changed. And I said, oh, good, okay. But he didn't tell me the part about my understanding, because I hadn't sold a house for 28 years, was that when you sold your house, then when you buy a new one, if it's of equal or greater value, you pass the you don't pay capital gains tax as long as you buy another house of equal or greater value. Well, that's what it was 28 years ago. It wasn't that way now. So then we owed a ton of money because our house appreciated a lot in the Bay Area, which was a good thing. But then I didn't know how much tax I was going to pay. So you learn from mistakes. And if you can learn from somebody else's mistakes, that's even better. So that's why I thought I'd share our error there, where we didn't know about the taxes, and what a bite that would be, what a thing that would be. Another thing that maybe all of you guys know, but I think a lot of people don't, is, well, some people might not, especially younger people, because they haven't gotten into the game of paying taxes and noticing that they went up when they made more money. But we have a graduated scale, and I think that's good. I think if you make more money, you can afford to pay more than your fair share. But we hear a lot about how, oh, the wealthy don't pay their fair share. So I looked online just to see, I was curious. And the top 1% of earned income earners make 21% of the gross income of the country. That's amazing. That one out of 100 makes 21%. But what do you suppose, what percentage of the total tax paid do you guys think they pay? Just a guess. Well, if they're not paying their fair share, it'd probably be about 10%, right? But it's 38.5. So instead of just being angry at the 1%, if I ever met somebody in the 1%, I'd say, thanks for paying 38.5% of our taxes. That's great. And I think that 10th Commandment has something to do with the, we had these guys camping in the cities all over the country, how they're so angry at the top 1%. And I think the 10th Commandment about coveting other people's circumstance and what they might have has something to do with that. But the truth is, the wealthy people pay most of the tax. The top 5% earn 36.5% of the earned income, but they pay 59.2% of the tax. Top 10% earn 47.7%. They pay 70% of the tax. The bottom 50 percentile earn 11% of the total income, and they pay 3.1%. So I'm not saying this is wrong. I think it's right. I think that's probably just about where it should be, that people pay in the top half, the top 10%, they pay almost double their fair share, and the bottom 50 pay about a third or a fourth of their fair share, as far as if we had, say, flat tax. Some people talk about a flat tax. I think a flat tax wouldn't be a bad idea, because I think that if you have some skin in the game, you're not always going to say, let's raise taxes all the time. But I think one way to do a flat tax, which most people have proposed a flat tax, is like the first $40,000 on a single payer, you would pay zero tax. And then that way, if you make $50,000, you're only paying tax on 1/5 of your total income. Whereas if you made $100,000, you'd be paying tax on 60% of your total income. Anyway, so that's enough of that. How are we doing on time? Any other ideas about taxes or questions about taxes, and I'm not an accountant, so I may not be able to answer, but if any of you guys have any questions.
I mean, you said Social Security is not, you don't think it'll be around a bit? Like what? So
Oh, yeah.
I'd be interested in that because,
Yeah, so if you look at, it's scheduled to run out of money at a certain time. I don't think it'll really run out of money. So I overstated it when I said that it may not be around. That's what some people will say. But the only way it is going to be around is if they make some changes. And they've already made a bit of a change, which they'll probably expand on that further. So it used to be you got full Social Security at 65. If you're my age, you get full Social Security at 66 years and 8 months. Now you can take it at 65, but you won't get, quote, full. You'll get a little bit less. You can even take it at 62, and then you get less still. And so they'll probably just keep raising the age, and we are living longer. One of the problems was when they started Social Security, the average age was like 65 or 68. You know, they expected people to be on Social Security for about 3 years or something, 3 or 4 years. Well, now people are living till 90 and 100 and whatever, so a lot longer than they. Now you could be on Social Security for 40 years or 30 years or something like that. So and if you have a job that isn't hard backbreaking manual labor, you can do it till you're 70 easier than you could before, because you know today's 70-year-olds as healthy as yesterday's 55-year-old or something like that. Or if you go back far enough to when they started Social Security. So I think that's the main thing, is they will just keep raising the age. They might also do means testing. And if they do that, they'll penalize you for saving money the way I'm telling you to save money. Because they might say, oh, if your net worth is X amount, then you don't get Social Security. Or they might say, instead of what your net worth is, how much money, what's your earned income on your tax return. So if you're taking a lot of money out of your savings, again, that's earned income, even if you're not working. So they'll do some different things like that, I think, to save it. So I don't think it will totally go away, but it may not be as good as it is now, would be my guess. So, any other questions? So on my next section here, things you don't learn in school, especially from the teachers or the professors, because they give their opinion on things and they don't say, you know what, compared to the whole country, I'm over here. And so when you hear me say things, take into consideration, I'm over here. In other words, if this were, let's see, which is your right or left here? This is my right. Anyway, so I think most high school and college professors lean to the left. And if you know that, it's fine. You're hearing these ideas from them. And to me, when it comes to politics, I'm kind of more interested in this tax stuff. Are we going to tax ourselves so much that the government makes more money than you do when you go to work every day? I mean, as it is now, you know, you hear people say, oh, well, it's June 1st. So the rest of the year you get to work for yourself. You've been paying the government from January 1 till now. Well, that depends on your tax bracket. You know, some people work for the government for a week and some people for 8 months or something. And it all depends. But to me, you know, all the social issues, I don't know. But how much should we spend of people's money? Like how much should go to the government? Should it be 20%? Should it be 70%? Whatever. That's sort of one of the main questions. But back to this whole thing about, I think there's a bit of bias. I went online to look to see if there was anything like that. And this guy named Mitchell Lambert studied the top 60 liberal arts colleges. And it turned out there were 10.4 registered Democrats for every one registered Republican, and 39% of academic departments did not have a single Republican on their faculty. I also heard a woman one time on a talk show who called in, and she said, after class, these two girls came up to me and said, you're a Republican, aren't you? And she said, why would you ask me that? I never talk about politics in school. And she said, you're our only professor that doesn't talk about politics, so we guess you're a Republican. She said, I'll lose my job if you tell anybody, because this school is so liberal. That's why I don't talk about politics. Please don't tell anyone. And so anyway, that was kind of comical, but I think things lean a little left that way. And also, Trump says fake news, fake news. I'm not going to defend Trump. He's a character. But Investors Business Daily found a study done by Arizona State and Texas A&M, and they reported that there were 13 liberals for every one Republican in the media. And if you only listen to Fox News, you're hearing a right-wing side of the story. If you're listening only to MSNBC, as far to the left, I just think it's important that people kind of understand when you hear these things, a lot of people have an axe to grind or a point of view to come from. So, and when you're in high school and college, you're getting a little less than what most people think. Gallup said in April 2020, and I'm surprised, I think it's a little more Democrats in this, they claimed that, or in their polling, 31% of the people were Democrats, 30% were Republicans, and 36% were independents. And I think we need more people in the middle. We need more, I'm going to always view every subject from my political party's point of view rather than on the environment. I'm pro-environment in a real big way, but on taxes, maybe I wish we could figure out a way to spend less or, anyway. So I thought I was going to take, or was tonight scheduled for only 45 minutes, Justin?
Yeah, I think the idea was 2 different 45-minute sessions, but and so.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm almost done. So I was kind of thinking there might be more dialogue. Maybe I'm skipping some things or talking too fast, but I could still do this again if somebody shows up on the second one.
Right. Okay, sure.
I'll log in either way.
Okay.
So I think the other thing they don't talk about in school is why are you here? And I don't mean at the Zoom meeting or why are you in the classroom? Why are you on this planet? And I'm not saying I want my high school teacher or college teacher to be teaching myself or my kids that, but that's something we need to address as people. And so, this is a church Zoom meeting. I'm a Christian. I believe everything in the Bible. I believe Jesus was the Messiah and all of that. But whether you're a Christian or not, do you think you're an accident of atoms randomly bumping into each other? Did atoms randomly bump into each other to form molecules, and some molecules bounced into each other and formed amino acids? Was there no designer of going from atoms and molecules and so on to the complex world we have? My wife and I just went to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and waterfalls and streams and grass and wild animals in the mountains, everything's so beautiful. Well, to have a type of animal that appreciates these a beauty the way humans do and can design and build things the way humans do, I think we're not just another random animal. And so for someone who is just curious about those things, one of the guys that I think sort of explained the way I believe real well was Lee Strobel. And again, a lot of you might have already know about his books, but he wrote The Case for Faith. And Lee grew up in the church, but then in college, had a lot of liberal professors, but he also wanted to party. And he said he lost his faith and married a woman that was not a Christian. And then she became a Christian. And he became really upset about it, because he didn't want some holier than thou person looking over his shoulder, judging him all the time. And it turned out she became a more gracious, loving, wonderful wife than she was before. So he said, wow, well, I'm not even going to tell her I'm curious about this stuff because I don't want her pestering me to be a believer. So he was a reporter for a Chicago newspaper, and he covered trials. So he was going to put Jesus on trial. So he went and interviewed about 10 or 12 different experts on different aspects of Jesus, like, did he really raise from the dead? Was he really crucified? A lot of the historical things about who Jesus was and what his claims were. And he asked hard questions, not softballs. He went out there and asked these guys really tough questions. Basically, the book is an interview with each of these, like 12 people or however many there were. And he was so impressed with the answers that he found that he ends up now he's like a pastor, and he's written The Case for Faith, which I think is a wonderful book, especially for people who have had tragedy in their lives, and a lot of us have, or maybe we don't, but we see other people have tragedy, hurricanes, tornadoes, disease, cancer, whatever. How do I square that with a loving God? And so he asked these really hard questions again. The case for faith, and this wasn't even only a Christian faith. How can I believe there's a God? And then also, you have the Darwinian theory of evolution and all of that. Well, are we random acts of things bouncing into each other? Usually, over time, things become less organized, not more organized. So he wrote a book called The Case for Intelligent Design. And all three of these books are asking hard questions of experts who have studied kind of a narrow part of each of these things. And I just would highly recommend those three books, especially to young people that are wondering, gee, is this stuff I hear about at church, if they've been to church or I've never been to church, what's this all about? I just think he explains things really well. It was very meaningful and insightful to me. So, and if you read the Bible, even if you're questioning or you're not a Christian or don't want to, I think you just understand our American society and Judeo-Christian ethics better if you do study the Bible. And so again, I'd highly recommend that. So my summary for the whole thing here, I've come to now, I think education is self-driven and you can do well no matter where you go to school. 80% of the wealthy people in this country did not inherit their wealth. They worked hard. I don't believe there's a finite pie, that if you have more than the average, you took something from somebody else. I think there are bad business people who will sell you snake oil or they don't care about the other person. They're just trying to gain wealth for themselves. But I think those are the exception, not the rule. I think most people want win-win relationships. Like, I was in sales and I would only sell things I thought my customer was better off with. And most people in business, I think, have integrity. They work hard. They're not trying to cheat anybody. And I think business is a good thing, not a bad thing. And I think a way to accumulate more wealth is to grow the pie bigger rather than steal a portion of somebody else's pie. And so I think if you have this optimistic attitude about no matter where I come from in this country, a lot of people who come here do really well, or if the first generation comes, doesn't speak English so well or have the higher education, their kids do really well. And I think it is a land of opportunity. It's not perfect. This country isn't perfect, never will be. I don't think other countries are perfect either. It's part of our human flaws. But if you play the money game well, it's a better thing to be a good steward of your blessings. And my dad went to a meeting one time and he came back with a button and it said, "I'm third." And I've tried to always think about what he had to say when I asked him about that. And even, we're talking about money, and money sometimes is kind of thought of, it's three things you don't talk to people about: money, religion, and politics. Well, especially in schools, they tend to talk about politics, but it's not their role really in those environments to be talking about those things. But I think if we're all of the point of view, I'm third, the world's a better place. And what that meant was God's first, others are second, and I'm third. And if we do that, I think that's good. I'm not saying I always am perfect at putting myself third, but that's a good way to go. So I hope this has been helpful. That's kind of all I've got. Does anybody have any questions or comments on things that I missed that you think a young person should know about? Feel free to jump in and ask a question or add a comment. Well, I learned in sales, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I haven't done this very well as far as that's concerned because I've been doing all the talking. But, my audience was more for younger people, but because some of you are my age. But if you even know a younger person, I think if you can just encourage them to start early. If they didn't start early, don't give up. Like I said, my dad had no net worth to speak of until he was older, but he had a good pension plan. So if you work for the government and you hang in there long enough with them, you're in good shape. If not, just do your best to, second best time to plant the tree is now. So,
Jeff, thank you. It's
okay.
I'm so Ivan Illich had the quote, if you want to change the world, tell a different story. And what you're doing is you're offering a different story to us, or at the very least, like maybe some younger kids who have never heard that story. The story of, yeah, you can invest, you can do simple achievable things early on in ways that can lead to great flourishing. So
Yeah, and
thank you.
I thought I'd just add, to me, an accomplished life doesn't mean you're the wealthiest person around. It doesn't mean you have the highest education. Doesn't mean you all these things. I think if you just have a good, solid life of integrity and you get rich slowly, you don't try any get rich quick schemes, but you just save consistently throughout your life, you'll be fine. And have integrity, serve others, serve God, love each other. It's all good.
Love it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for offering that stuff. That's good.
All right.
All right.